you come out of the service and I think that there's an idea of people don't care. Maybe that's not the therapist for you, but somebody, the right one, will care, and you'll know that you're cared about. And when you have that space, you'll recognize it. And so I want you guys to know that I'm so proud, and I'm deeply honored also to be able to work with you in the first place. It has been my honor to help my clients, and I'm so proud of you.
Welcome to the Vet Rise podcast. I'm your host, Juan Perez. My goal is to make success after service accessible to every veteran in society. I believe in the power of leveraging your service, not as a label that defines you, but as a launching pad for your next chapter. What we have been doing hasn't been working, and it's on us to start changing the culture. Enjoy the episode, and thank you for your time. What's up, everybody? Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Vet Rise podcast. Today, we have another guest with us. Today, we have someone that I came across through TikTok. And honestly, it was the first time that I heard the concept of leaving the military as loss and grief. And it made me really think about things from a different perspective. So without stealing too much of her thunder, I'm going to have Beth introduce herself, tell us a little bit about herself, and then we will dive into some very deep conversations. I have a feeling that this is going to be a very good episode. So Beth, why don't you go ahead and lead the journey?
Absolutely. So hi, I'm Beth, and I started TikTok completely just because I was having an off day and thought maybe somebody needed to hear something kind. And then I realized I am a therapist, so I may as well use the knowledge that I have for good. Why not share it with people that I know need access to it? And so to start, I am an AMFT. That means I'm an associate therapist. I went to school, got my degrees, and now in the state of California, you need 3,000 one-on-one hours to be able to get qualified to take your licensing test. So I'm at like 2,000 hours now. I have about a year left. And I started my journey working with elementary school kids, and I loved it. They were fantastic. They were cute. I loved playing games. And then COVID hit, and I was like, this is the worst thing ever. I don't want to keep a 5-year-old on a phone call. This is not enjoyable. And so then I took a year off. I had my son, and then I went back into the private practice setting, and I started working with teens. And I was like, they can talk. They're one-on-one. I can sit down on a couch with them, and I love the conversations we have. And I did. But I did not like working with families. And unfortunately, in the therapy world, in order to do that, you have to work with families. And the parents and I just did not align. And I realized this is not my population either. So in the therapy world, we try to find our niche. And so it takes some time. It takes a couple of years usually. And if we're lucky, we find it early. And if you don't, it can just take time and you jump around from population to population. So then I went to a different private practice, started working with women with trauma, and I loved that too. And then I thought, you know what, I'd like to gain more hours. And so my supervisor had posted a job listing. And I was like, oh, okay, let me just meet this person. Maybe we have good energy. Maybe we get along. And instantly it was a connection. And I'll never forget her asking me, do you work with veterans? And I was like, no, I don't. And she said, well, that's mostly my population. They're actually combat veterans. Would you be interested? And I was like, sure, I'll try it. Who knows what can come from this? And along this path, so now I've been working with veterans for almost a whole year. So next week, it will be a whole year that I've been working with just combat veterans. I do have a couple of veterans who did not do combat and active duty overseas, but for the most part, out of like the 13, I think 11 of them were combat veterans. So I started off with that. And we built my caseload up, and then gradually I started to recognize, oh no, this is my population. I love these people. Like, they respond so well to me. They will listen, and they will take the advice that I give, which I start to wonder, also I'll get to that, if that's a good thing or a bad thing. And so that's how I got into working with combat veterans. And now I've transitioned over, and I only have a couple of civilian clients left. And I'm hoping to make them all combat veterans or just veterans in general, because this is my population and I love them so much. So that's a little bit about me.
I love that. So you decided to work with combat veterans, and they're your people. I love that.
They are. They're
And
very
what?
special and unique.
Yeah, yeah. Have you had the experience of seeing how veterans can be, as far as a lot of deprecating, dark humor, and
Yeah.
really, yeah,
Yes, I have. And I take it in stride. And so I always joke around, and like one of my vets that I had, I think literally this week, he made a joke. And I said, "Oh, are we avoiding something? We should go back to that." And he was like, "Oh," and instantly knew that he was. And the dark humor doesn't bother me because I know it comes with the territory and I expect it. And I know it is just basically, it's a way to cope. It's a coping mechanism that you guys use and that you also bonded through with each other. So the idea is that when you go into the military and you create these bonds, they're lifelong most of the time. And that dark humor gets you guys kind of aligned. There's familiarity, there's comfortability in that. So when my vets actually make dark humor jokes in session, I'm like, oh, they trust me. Okay, that's really cool. I like that. And then I'll use that, right? And we'll talk about whatever it is underneath that also. But definitely happens, and I don't mind.
interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess I never thought of it that way either. Interesting. So, yeah, I think that I think that we use dark humor, especially when
Mm-hmm.
we're going through something that can be miserable, or something that is not ideal, or we've been in the field for 5 days without showering. Maybe, we're going through a situation, or we're suffering together, and there's that shared trauma, if you will. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of that. I mean, especially so myself. For those of you that don't know, I deployed to Afghanistan, a Marine
Mm-hmm.
Corps infantryman. Came back, and I was a scout sniper. And the second deployment was on a MEU, but I feel much closer to the guys that I deployed to combat with. Nothing against
Mm-hmm.
the guys in the steel platoon, but I keep in touch with the guys that I deployed to Afghanistan with much more, just because I feel like we have these shared experiences that you can't replicate anywhere else, and why would you, right? So I definitely think that there's something there, and
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you as far as it is a trust thing, because it's a way of sharing something without coming out and saying it, right? And
Yes.
I think especially in therapy, when you share something like that,
Mm-hmm.
because I've been in therapy myself for years, right? And you know that the she or he, whoever you're in therapy with,
Mm-hmm.
is going to ask you or say something about it. So I think it's a way of opening up without directly opening up. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I would say that most of the time it's almost as if it's like, I give the analogy of like doors opening and closing. So the door is closed means like they're not going to go there. The door's cracked means like, oh, I can maybe push it open a little bit. And then there is locked. And when the door is locked, it takes a lot of work for us to unlock it. And I feel like that dark humor is like the door is cracked and they're like, hey, Beth, like, did you pick that up? And so I'll ask them and be like, hey, let's talk about that. And they'll be like, oh, but every time I do, they'll talk about it. And it's
Mm.
like almost as if their brain is like, hey, you can share that with her. She'll accept it. And so that's a big thing also. In
Hmm.
therapy, we have something called unconditional positive regard that we learn in school. And I don't know if it's something that you can actually learn. So the idea behind that is that you have a bond with your clients where they understand they are accepted no matter what. The idea is that you can tell me anything. It's not going to skew my perspective of you. It's not going to change my view of you. You can share these things with me, and you're still going to be accepted here, and you're still safe with me. Essentially, is what that means. And if you can grow that with your clients, then you kind of have an opening to talk about anything. So my vets will start off usually very slowly, and they will gradually grow that. And with enough time of me giving them that unconditional positive regard, they will share more and more. So it sounds something like, let's say I ask them about boot camp and they start talking about their boot camp experiences, right? And sometimes they'll talk about, things that civilians don't understand is the best way I can put it. And that's another thing is I'm a civilian. I came into this without any knowledge about anything military. And now I have all of this gained information where I have a different added level of understanding. So I make sure to extremely give them that unconditional positive regard. Hey, it's okay that you said that. I'm sorry that you experienced that. How do you feel sharing it with me? What does it feel like having to tell me that? Have you ever shared that with somebody that you know outside of the people you served with, right? Most of the time it's no. Most of the time they have never spoken about these things. Most of the time they never have talked about it. Most of the time they don't feel safe to do that, even because they're afraid they're not going to be accepted. They're going to get judged. Their wives or partners will be afraid of them, right? Things like that. But when you're in the safety of session, they know that I'm accepting of them, and I'll tell them I'm still here. It doesn't change how I think about you.
Yeah, honestly, that is very, it's very valuable because I know for me, when I started therapy,
Mm-hmm.
you worry about feeling judged. You worry about saying something that's going to make the other person on the other side of the room from you look at you differently. And I
Yeah.
think I speak from personal experience, but I also think that in the general veteran community, especially from what I've seen in a lot of veterans in lately on social media and everywhere, is that there's either the belief that therapy does work or it doesn't. And I believe 100% that it does. But
Mm-hmm.
you have to want it to work. I personally think, right? You have to go into it with an open mind. I think that when you go into it, you're going to be a little bit skeptic. And
Mm-hmm.
nothing against you. Obviously, you're a
No,
civilian. So I think
I
that
expect
that
it.
adds that extra level of like, how
Mm-hmm.
is this person going to understand me? How is this person going to be able to relate to me? But I also think that there is a benefit to that. The reason being is one of the therapists that I was seeing, she is a Marine. She served, and I also felt like I couldn't necessarily, and I was able to lower my guard, but I also felt like I didn't want to be perceived as less of a Marine. So I think that there's benefits to both sides, of course. But I
Mm-hmm.
think that the fact that we're out, we're not there to talk only about the time in, we're here to talk about our time out now, how we're transitioning or how we're changing our perspective, finding new purpose, the things that we're dealing with. And
Mm-hmm.
there's definitely benefits to having someone that can relate to you in one way, shape, or form, but also benefits of understanding someone that is going to help you change your perspective, like shift your mindset to understand that things do operate differently out here.
I
And we
do.
have to understand that. We have to see that. Because if we don't, like, I think that one of the reasons why I started therapy was definitely because I felt stuck. I
Mm-hmm.
felt like I didn't fit in and I didn't relate to people. And if that's what I'm going into therapy with, then I guess the goal or the outcome would be the opposite, right? To feel like I can relate to people, I can fit in, and I am understood, and I don't feel stuck anymore. And I feel
Mm-hmm.
like, can you talk a little bit more about that? Do you feel like that's something that you help veterans get to a point of feeling like, they are in their world now? This is their culture.
Yeah, so in order for them to get to that place, right, I explain it like this. In order for you to get to a place of acceptance, it means that you have to process things, which means you're going to have to go back to the past. You're going to have to
Mm-hmm.
accept the things of the past. You're going to have to mourn and grieve. And that's where that grieving and loss comes in that I talked about when I stitched your TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
Because in order for you to move past things, you have to go through them. So the way that we talk about in therapy, and so I use DBT a lot, and that's dialectical behavioral therapy. And the short-term version of this is essentially the idea that there are two truths at the same time. So you can grieve the loss of something and still need to move forward. Both are true, both are valuable, both can be there and present at the same time. A lot of the times we think in black and white, it's either or, and that's not the case. It can be both at the same time. And so the idea is through DBT, we teach you guys how to emotionally regulate. We teach you how to identify what you're feeling. And that is probably the biggest thing that I see aside from grief and loss is that they don't even have the awareness that they're grieving. and that they're experiencing loss. And I try to explain it in terms of this of you join the military, you start boot camp, and in boot camp, they teach you to shut off your emotions. Emotions are weaknesses. If you have emotions, they're going to get shut down really fucking fast. And if they get shut down, guess what? You're going to operate only in that capacity. That's how your brain survives. And if you show weaknesses, it's handled, it's addressed. It is seen immediately that you are weak, and you guys are probably going to fight. There's going to be something to clear it up. You're going to show who you are. You're going to show up, and you're not going to show that weakness again because you cannot afford that. And also, it keeps you alive. It trains you guys to stay alive when you're out there doing active duty combat. That's how it works. And so they really hone into your fight or flight. So your central nervous system is lit up, and you guys don't have the ability to kind of run. You only know to fight. So it lights up that part of the brain. Well, it shuts everything else off. You don't know what you're feeling. So when my vets come to therapy and I'm like, hey, what are you feeling? They're like, I'm fucking pissed, Beth. And I'm like, are you? Are you though? I don't think that you are. And they're like, what do you mean I'm not? I'm like, I'm sure you're angry, but I don't think that's the primary. Like, there's a secondary to that. So the idea is that I try to get them to identify their secondary. So I'll list things out most of the time. I'm like, are you feeling betrayed? Are you feeling frustrated? Are you disappointed? Are you grieving something, right? Usually it's one of those, but it's showing up as anger because that's your go-to. That's how you guys operate. It's anger, responding, and fighting. That's what you guys do. That's all that you've known for years. And that's what you operate on. And so you come to therapy, you don't even know that you're experiencing these feelings. So usually it starts off with me trying to get them to identify even what they're feeling, label it, figure it out. When you're angry, take a second and hesitate. What else am I feeling, right? Once we get to that point, then they start to process the grief and the disappointment, betrayal, right? A lot that I see is in marriages. There's a lot of betrayal and divorce. There's a lot of betrayal when there's deployments, right? On both sides. There's a lot of guilt. There's a lot of grief there, right? If you lost somebody, your brotherhood, feeling like you don't know who you are anymore, having this identity crisis in a sense. That's grieving the loss of who you used to be, and you had a purpose. You had an identity, and that kind of is lost in translation. So when you come to therapy, well, you can't even get to that point until you identify what you're feeling. And you can't even figure out what you're feeling until I start to ask you these questions like, hey, let's talk about it. There's something else there. There's something deeper. Once we get to that point, then we go through the process. Once you're able to sit with the grief, and sitting with the grief, I explain to my clients, is you talk about it in session. We go back to memories that you had that were good. We talk about memories that were bad. We pick out the emotions that are linked to that, right? And then you sit through that. And most of the time, my veterans cry. And I'll ask them, how do you feel crying? And they're like, this is the worst shit ever. And I'm like, yeah, I'm sure it is, because your bodies don't know this. When's the last time you cried? And they're like, I couldn't even tell you the last time I cried. Most of them can't even tell me. And there's a level of vulnerability that's there. And I always tell them, as a therapist, I had to go to therapy while I was in grad school to become a therapist, because they wanted us to know what it was like to be on the other end, to have to process and be vulnerable and cry and get these things out, to know what our clients are probably going to feel. And so I'll always reassure them that unconditional positive regard. Hey, I know you probably feel really vulnerable. I know that this probably really sucks. I know this is really uncomfortable for you. I'm here with you. It does not change how I view you. It does not change what you experienced. I'm here with you. And that usually will help them. Also, I'm kind of an unorthodox therapist. So my clients will come and say that it's more of like, almost they're talking to a friend sometimes, because I will share about my life. I'll use experiences that I've gone through, betrayal and grief and loss, and I'll use my experiences to explain how I got through them. And then they feel like, oh, okay, she's willing to share about herself. I can share about myself. And I don't know if that's really a thing in the therapy world, much less if veterans find therapists that will do that. And so my clients will open up pretty quickly because they recognize, oh, Beth is holding space for me and I can hold space for her.
Yeah, I don't think I ever experienced that specifically, and I think it would have definitely helped. And yeah, I remember. So I started therapy in 2015, 2 years after I left the military, and it was hard. It was hard. I remember I went through CBT, and it was talking about these experiences, these emotions, these incidents that I went through. And I remember for the first, I don't know, 10 times I would leave feeling drained, feeling like, what am I
Yes.
doing? Is this even helping? Like I started crying, and I would be shut down for the rest of the day.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a hill, I guess would be a great metaphor for it. Because once I got over that hill, I started coming down from it. I started feeling better after I would talk about it and go through it and be able to actually open up about incidents and experiences that I went through. And I was able to finally talk about some things that I held very, very near and dear to my heart as my fault, my responsibility, specifically one incident, one scenario that I've talked about openly before on the podcast, where I felt like I was responsible for the death of a Marine, where I wasn't. The memory that I had was completely skewed in a direction that I took ownership over it when it wasn't mine to own. And the scenario basically is where we were in Afghanistan in Helmand province, and our point man, he stepped on an IED. And he lost both of his leads, and we came under fire, and he was medevac, and he was able to survive the explosion, thankfully. But then what I felt, my perception at the time, felt like a week or so later, they sent an EOD team out to the blast site. And while they were doing what they did at the blast site, another IED that had been there the entire time went off, and it took the life of a Marine. And for the longest, I felt like it should have been me. I was right there in the same spot, and I didn't understand why it didn't just blow me up. This 21-year-old Marine, myself, no kids, no family, no wife, completely willing to die in country several times under fire. One time on a rooftop, I remember like telling myself, like, this is where I die. I'm going to take a round to the fucking face, and I'm going to die right here. And I experienced that multiple times. So I kept coming back to that and being very angry at the fact that it should have been me instead of this 34-year-old, I believe he was 34 at the time, gunnery sergeant with 2 kids and a wife at home. And it's so eerie to say that now, because now I am roughly around that age, and I have 2 kids at home. I'm getting goosebumps right now. And the way that I remembered it is not how it actually played out. It was a different location. It was not the same spot. There was nothing that I could have done. There was, and even if it was the same IED explosion blast site, there was nothing that I could have done to change anything. But for so many years, I held that in, and I felt this anger. I felt like it should have been me, without even thinking about what that would have done to my family. But I just kept thinking about his family. I kept thinking about his kids, and just being angry at the fact that I was still here and he wasn't. Up until recently, I found out that my memory was completely skewed from what
Mm-hmm.
actually happened. And it was completely different site, like I mentioned. But it was hard for me to talk about. And I couldn't talk about it until I started going to therapy. And even then, they asked me, which I'd love to get your feedback on this, but they
Sure.
asked me to think about the one incident in my life that was causing me PTSD, if you will. And I disagreed with that. I felt like, well, is it one incident, or is it all of it? I mean, it's more than just one thing that I went through. It's everything, right? And
Mm-hmm.
we focused on this one incident, and thankfully my therapist was able to open up, and I was able to share with her more than just that one incident, a bunch of other stuff that I went through. For example, like, I'm open to talk about this now, but up until recently, I realized, and this is going to be so weird to say out loud for the first time, but
Yeah.
I realized that and I'm having trouble even saying it now. This is a therapy session, Beth. Um, I realized that I was a victim of sexual assault in the military,
Mm-hmm.
but I never said it out loud because I was a male, she was a female, NCO, higher rank than me. And at the time, I felt like who would not want to trade places with me,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I realized that that's not actually what happened. And there's a lot more trauma. So I believe that once you start opening doors, like you said, right, you're going to realize that there's other monsters and skeletons and past trauma and past things that you've repressed that you don't think about. And I think one of the powers of therapy is shedding light on it. And
It is.
I promise I'm almost done here. Um, but I think that shedding light on it gives you a little bit of control over how you see it, right? So I would love to get your feedback on everything that I just trauma dumped on you right there.
Well, one, let me just explain this. And I tell my clients, so I had a veteran come in. He's 55. And I remember he saw me and goes, "How old are you?" And I was like, and I expect it, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
was like, "I'm 32." My training would have told me to tell him, "Why are you asking? Are you concerned that I can't help you? What's your hesitation? Why do you want to know my age?" That's how I was kind of trained as a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
Working with vets, absolutely not. I was like, "I'm 32." And then I go into it. "What's on your mind? Talk to me about it." And he was like, "I don't know if you're going to be prepared to hear the things that I experienced." And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely." And so for me, the way that I deal with it is I have a black box, is what I call it. And one of my clients who is from my Women with Trauma, she was very much artistic, and she would go places in her mind. And she and I came up with this concept of black box. And black box is essentially where you have this figurative like area in your mind, and when you hear things that are maybe really difficult or are really traumatic, I stick them in that black box because they're not mine to hold. I will allow space for them, but I don't keep them. So I'm not going to hold on to it and relive it for you, but I will hold space for you to give me that. And then I'll put it into my black box and I do not revisit those things again. And I explained this to him and he was like, "Oh." And I'm like, "You don't have to worry about me. I'm really good at self care. I'm really good at what I do. I know how to hold space for you. I will make sure that I put it in my black box, whatever you share." So to start, if there's something there, that's where black box goes. The rest of it, one, I'm really proud of you for sharing it. My brain automatically goes to therapy mode. As you're saying it, like everything in me was like, "Ooh," the therapist jumped out. Like, I am so extremely proud. That is so brave and that is so hard. And that's not something easy to have to say aloud. And like you said, you could hear yourself like, I don't even know if like I'm trying to get it out. It takes time to get something like that out because it's not something that is normalized either. And if it's not normalized, there's a fear of judgment, right? You're like, am I going to be judged? Am I going to be like held to a different standard? Am I going to be viewed differently? And so those ones are really hard too. Um, Adding on to that, I hear things often that people don't talk about. And I wish that everybody else in the veteran community was more open to talking about it because it's not a single occurrence. It's just something that's not accepted and is not discussed. It's one of those things that's swept under the rug and you just move forward. And that is like the idea behind it. And it doesn't have to be that way. And when my clients come in and they share things with me, like what you just did, my brain automatically goes to, I immediately wanted to stop you and say, "Hold on really fast. What are you feeling?" Because you said, "I have goosebumps." I'm like, so your body's giving a response, right? My brain automatically, like it wanted to kick into therapy mode immediately while we're doing this and be like, "Hold on. Like, yes, you're talking about it, but what are you feeling?" Because there's a feeling there. That's what we do when I'm in session. That's the kind of thing that I'm going to do because they'll tell me stuff and the story is important, but I'm like, but what's the feeling? CBT is amazing because it works well and we know that it does. But CBT does not go into the emotion side. So I explain CBT as a triangle. Your thoughts impact your behaviors, that impacts your emotions. If you can control your thoughts, you can control your emotions and then your behaviors, and you can control the cycle. DBT makes you go into the feeling Because as a therapist, every therapist has a different perspective, right? We all go into our training and we have different ideas. There are therapists who think that you only focus on the present, here and now. There are therapists who think that you should focus on the future and how to get to a place that you want to be, and you can include the present. And then there's therapists that are like, no, we need to talk about the past. That past is impacting your present, and that present is going to impact what your future looks like. I always explain, I'm a therapist where I'm like, we need to talk about the past. And I tell people, sometimes I might not be a good fit, and that's okay. Maybe you don't want that style of therapy. And I always tell people, therapists are like hairdressers and barbers. Sometimes you're going to have to try a couple times to find one that's good. And that's normal. That's supposed to happen. If you're that picky about your hair, imagine how you're going to feel about talking about really hurtful things that you've experienced. I expect nothing less. Now, I will say I've never had a client leave. Not once have they been like, hey, Beth, you're not my style of therapist. They always have stayed. But sometimes that's not the case. And I would expect at some point in my career, somebody is going to leave. That's just what happens in therapy. So DBT is the idea of, instead of doing that, we're going to focus on the emotion instead. We're going to talk about, what did you feel? Where did those goosebumps come from? Because that feeling, trauma is stored in the body. And there are podcasts about that you can find out there talking about trauma. Trauma is stored in the body. And so that means in order to get that trauma out, you have to figure out the emotions. You have to relive it. And so the PTSD side to that, I will have my clients I do a ladder. And it's something that I did with my kiddos. And so when I had little kids that came into session, they'd be like, Miss Beth, like, I'm so upset. And I'm like, what are you worried about? They're like, oh, I have to go to recess. And like, what if they stare at me? What if I fall playing dodgeball, right? All these things. And we would create a ladder. I do that with my vets too. So I'll ask them, I want you to list it out. You don't have to go into detail. You don't have to reside in it right now, but let's make a ladder. Lowest rung is something that's manageable that you can talk about to me right now today. And the highest on the rung is the one that is the most traumatic, that you think that impacts you the most, that is reoccurring, that you have flashbacks of, right? So PTSD is the flashbacks. It can be sensory. You are out and about and you hear a sound and it reminds you of that, and you go back into that moment. You see something and it reminds you of that, and you go back into that moment, right? And we build up to it. And so I tell them, we're going to go through the ladder, and we start at the lowest and we process that. And we keep coming back to that over and over and over again. We get the feelings out, we address it, we allow you space to sit with it. Then we go to the next thing on the ladder and we build our way up. Because it's kind of unrealistic to expect my clients to be like, hey, I'm going to go to the 10th rung and we're good to go. Most of the time that doesn't happen, and I don't expect that. And so we work our way up the ladder. And so I'll have them categorize it and we'll make a ladder together. And that's kind of how we go through if there are multiple things for PTSD. And my mindset is, it's not usually just one. Yes, there is usually one big one, but there are like a lot of little small ones that are going to be interlinked to that, or that are going to be attached to that, or that are going to come from that, right? Because something happened and then it made you do this behavior instead. And so we go through a whole process of all of it. And so that's why when my vets come to session and the VA gives them 6 months, I'm like, oh no, this isn't a 6-month kind of a problem. This is not something that's going to be just, hey, you're healed. I think people have this concept for therapy too of, oh, if you talk about it, then it's healed. And I think people think healed and cured are the same words, and they're not. And my perspective is, I don't think that things get cured from us. And that's not a bad thing. And I always preface that. And I explain as, the things that we experience in life, those are lessons. They guide us, they shaped us, they molded us, they've created us to be this version of ourselves. And you have to allow that space to kind of reside there. They're not going to go away. We just learn to manage them. We learn to identify triggers. We learn to sit with the feeling. We learn to identify it. We learn to regulate it, right? It's going into the feeling, sitting with it to let it go. And so part of that is, yeah, it's not going to go away. And I think there's a concept of the idea like, oh, it's going to go away, Beth, it's never going to come back. And I'm like, absolutely not. That's not how it works. Our brain and our psyche doesn't work that way. It's going to recall things. It just gets easier with time instead.
All right, let's stop for a minute. This is the part of the episode where I ask you to do me a favor, but it's not a favor for me. It's a favor for your fellow brothers and sisters that served with you. Do me a favor. Think hard and share this podcast with someone that you think would benefit from it. If you know someone that has been struggling, if you know someone that is going through it right now, and you know that they want better for life, they just don't know how to do it. If this podcast can help them, do it. That's it.
That's my only ask. If you want to follow me, then great. You want to subscribe? Go for it. I appreciate you guys so much. Thank you for your time. Back to the episode.
Yeah. Ooh, I have so many thoughts. The first thing that's coming up for me.
Yeah.
That's how I used to answer when I was going to therapy. So I want to share this.
Yeah.
So I was going to therapy. I made it past the hill, figuratively, and it was easier for me to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized that labeling the emotions would have definitely been more helpful. But I also realized that I did let go of that guilt and there was anger there, right? And shame and all these sorts of emotions. And a lot of it had to do with me feeling less of myself, me feeling like I think the military does an amazing job of indoctrinating you into what they need you to be. But then you get out and there is just no sort of preparation for you to realize that you need to leave some of that behind, that you need to focus on leveraging the skills that the military gave you or brought out in you that are going to really serve you in society. But also, here's one, and this one's controversial, specifically for the Marine Corps.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the motto, the saying, once a Marine, always a Marine, has turned into this mentality of you're still in and you're not. Like, we need to learn to let that be a chapter of our lives, an amazing chapter. But I feel like a lot of veterans, Marines specifically, because it's what I know, they lean back into that and they don't want to change a lot of who they are because they felt like, rightfully so, it served them well when they were
Mm-hmm.
in. Like being a hard charger, having this cocky attitude, which, you know, can be confidence when you get out if you hone it right. But it really serves you when you're in. But when you get out, you don't want to leave that behind because you feel like, well, this is all I know. This is my culture. This is what served me well when I was in. And we don't realize that it's going to start to look a little bit differently out here. Like the hyper vigilance starts to look like paranoia, in my opinion. The confidence starts to look like cockiness. The, you know, proud courage starts to look like ego. And I think that we have to do a better job of learning to translate the things that help us and also leave a lot of that stuff behind. And all of this is to say that when I was in therapy, I don't remember why I stopped growing initially. I don't remember what was it, the catalyst that was like, I'm good or I'm done. I don't know what it was. I don't think it was forced. I don't think that I only had a certain number of sessions, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure that it had something to do with my personal life. And I think it was something to do with the fact that I got married and I felt like I have all this dopamine. I'm feeling better. I'm focusing a lot less, and I see you nodding, so I feel like there's definitely something there. I'm focusing a lot less on my past, and I'm currently living in my present, right? But then, dun dun dun, a few moments later, I went through more issues in life, and I went through a divorce. My fault. I became very unhappy at work. I realized that I was drinking every day after work. I was using food to cope. I wasn't working out. I wasn't sleeping right at all. I went through my first divorce, and immediately what I resorted to was dating. Like, I mean, dating a lot. And I had hundreds of dates because I felt like, well, I need to catch up because I married this, you know, girl that no fault of her own, but she was the only person that I knew because she was the only person that showed me any love when I left the military. And part of that was because I was in an infantry unit surrounded by nothing but men, right? And when I dated, I was in California, and when I dated in California, I always felt like I was perceived in this certain way, and I never really dated when I was out in California. So I got home, and there's this person that's showing me all this love and compassion. And to be honest, even though we were very incompatible, I kept trying to make it work, make it fit, make it make sense. And then, like I said, I went through a divorce because of my fault, my doing, and then I reverted to all these negative tendencies, and all of this spiraled into me getting remarried way too soon when I was in the darkest of places. And since then, thankfully, I've done a lot of healing. I went back into therapy, and everything kind of happened at once. I felt very lost in my personal life, and then also in my career. The agency that I worked for, they decided to disband the unit that I was working in, which is everything that I had worked towards in my career in law enforcement. So I went from doing some of the coolest stuff that I wanted to do, and then working in some of the coolest positions that I had ever wanted to do in my life, to completely being stripped away of that and being put in a position where I wasn't enjoying what I was doing. And then at the same time, we withdrew from Afghanistan. And I think that I took that personally. So, like, the culmination of all of these things happening at once. And then at the same time was everything, right? So, like, it was during the pandemic, and during, the time where the pendulum started to swing in the opposite direction for law enforcement, and there was all this hate and all this anger towards law enforcement. And it was hard for me to rectify that. It was hard for me to understand it, because I went from military, scout sniper, which is all I ever wanted to do when I was young. I remember watching Jarhead and being like, that's what I want to do. And then I would watch, movies from, for police, and that's undercover cops and all these cool things. I'm like, that's what I want to do. And then feeling all this hate towards me because of what I do for a career or just for work, right? And then, again, my marriage fell apart. I went into another very unhealthy marriage, and everything just came spiraling at me. And I felt even more lost than I felt the first time. And that's when I decided to go back into therapy, and it helped. But then I also felt like, what am I working towards? If I already dealt with my initial trauma, the PTSD, and this was a conversation I had with my therapist at the time. It's like, what am I doing here? If this is therapy for my PTSD, if this is therapy for my veteran issues, I don't feel like these are veteran issues anymore. And even though they were, maybe they weren't, I don't know. I don't even know where I'm going with this, but I'm gonna let you jump in, because I feel like you have some feedback.
There's two things that came to my mind when you were talking about it. And the
Mm-hmm.
first was, I look for themes, and I see themes working with this population, right? And it will be like, in a span of a week, I will hear something, and I'm like, oh my God, this is the third time. Okay, I keep hearing this. Let me sit with this. And my therapist brain is like, let me just figure out, what am I hearing? So what you're saying and what my brain picked up was, oh, I hear grief again. I hear grief in almost every aspect of that. I hear grief over, I heard you say something that stood out was somebody showing you attention and you knowing it wasn't healthy, but still doing it. Then I heard dopamine. And so I explain dopamine a lot to my clients too, because I explain it as, you guys are in a dopamine deficit. Dopamine is the feel-good, pleasure-seeking hormone of the brain. It wants that, and our brains need it to function. When you're in the military, you guys get dopamine from a couple of ways. There's like 6 or 7 that I see consistently. And you'll combine them, and you guys will get your dopamine kicks from this. And then sometimes it will turn into adrenaline. And that is fighting, fucking, caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, working out, and gambling.
Yes.
And you'll combine them, right? So you'll go out and, you'll go out and drink, and then maybe you get into a fight, and then, hey, you're going to hook up with somebody. Guess what you just got? You got some dopamine. that kick is going to stay there for a little while. In the military, you guys don't have the ability to create healthy dopamine. Dopamine as in mindfulness, as in meditation, as in sitting with things and processing them and getting dopamine from that, having the ability to say no to things, right? You get dopamine from completing tasks when you want to. You don't have that luxury. That's not how it works. And so your bodies are in a constant state of a deficit of dopamine is something that my brain immediately starts thinking of. Oh, there's no dopamine. You guys go into dopamine seeking behavior, and then you get out of the military and you go still into dopamine seeking behavior because that's all that you know. You've never been taught anything else. You don't know what it looks like. You don't even know what's happening. So then you get out, you start dating. Guess what happens when you date? You get dopamine. And then if you sleep with them, you're getting dopamine. And then if you're going to a bar and you're blacking out every weekend, you're getting dopamine. And then if you get into a fight, guess what? You're getting some adrenaline with that dopamine too. And your body loves that one. It's like, ooh, I'm back in the days. I know what this feels like. This is real nice. I know it's happening, right? It's familiarity. And you're grieving the loss of that familiarity in a life that you had for so long, every day, every weekend with these people. And you're still seeking dopamine, not recognizing that you're dopamine seeking. And it's all linked into, oh, you guys are at a deficit. And then you're grieving the loss of things that you guys haven't processed. Something that you said was recognizing that it's a chapter that you can leave behind. My therapist brain goes yes and no. And the reason I say yes and no is I think, yes, it is a chapter, but no, it's not something that you have to leave behind. It's acceptance. It's acceptance that that chapter is there. It's always present. It's never going to leave you. You don't have to make it leave, but you can do it better and you can do it healthier and you can be more adaptable and you can still reside in a place of, I miss this and I long for this and this was my life for so long and I grieve it. But I also need to adapt to now being into civilian world, them not understanding me, them not knowing where I'm coming from. The biggest one that I hear, the one that really hurts me as a therapist is disrespect. I'm like, ooh, disrespect in the military and veterans is the highest thing. If I could tell somebody, a civilian, any lesson, please do not disrespect these people. It is like wounding. It is the worst thing you could possibly do. You have no idea what you're saying. So when wives are, I say, for example, when I have my combat vets and they're like, I tried talking to my wife this week and I'm like, what happened? Tell me about it, right? And they'll say, oh, well, she picked up her phone or she ignored me. I'm like, oh, you felt disrespected. And they're like, yeah. I instantly was like, you're done. I'll never bring this up again. Cool. Now I know what you think of me. And it's so hard to change that. And so disrespect is a huge theme. And that disrespect comes with grief too, because you're used to living in the military where respect was the highest, utmost thing. And you're in civilian life and you're going to have to grieve the loss of people consistently disrespecting you on a day-to-day basis. And they don't have any comprehension even that they're doing it sometimes. And sometimes they knowingly are doing it and they're like, I don't care, right? But disrespect, grief, dopamine. I hear these three themes consistently week by week all the time.
Yes, to everything. Yeah, there's a lot of grief in things that you don't even realize you're grieving. I think that was something that I experienced, and without even realizing that I was going to experience that when we left Afghanistan the way we did.
Yeah.
Because I feel like it completely devalued everything and anything that I did, that my friends did, that we were supposed to be doing out there in Afghanistan, and we just abandoned it. And the way we did it, it felt disrespectful.
Yeah.
Disrespect.
And a client say betrayal. He was like, I felt betrayed, Beth. And I was like, yeah, let's sit with that one. Betrayal and grief, right?
It felt like betrayal. It felt like grief. And it made me question, like, what was it all for? What was it all for? And not just that, but I've lost more friends to suicide than my platoon specifically. We've lost more of our guys to suicide than we lost in country. And you just have to wonder, would the result been different if we hadn't deployed, if we weren't over there. And it's one of those things that you just I don't know if you can if we can ever know, but it definitely felt like betrayal. And it's hard to cope with, right? And
it comes out as anger most of the time too. If you don't know what you're feeling, you're pissed off. You're angry that they pulled out that way. You're angry at how it was done. You're angry at like these lives that are lost. Well, actually, that's grief, right? But until somebody tells you, hey, you're experiencing grief, and that's betrayal, and you're allowed to have both of those. So those are the things I tell my clients. You're allowed to have those. Those are allowed to be there. I would expect nothing less. I would be shocked if you do not feel betrayed and you feel grief, and you feel guilt also, right? Guilt can be a big one that I hear too, because you're like, what did I do it for? Oh my gosh, right? And you start to process the things that you've done while you were there, right? And I tell them all of those things are valid and they're allowed to be there. The idea for DBT too is you give space to what you're feeling. You let it reside there. You allow it the space. You validate it and say, it makes sense why it's here. I know why it's here because of X, Y, and Z happening. I know why I feel betrayed. And you let it reside there. And by doing that, your brain stops sitting there and tricking itself and telling itself like, no, you're just pissed. Don't think about that. Don't think about that, and avoiding it, right? Or pushing it down or being angry and it's coming out in other ways. You're not recognizing, oh, you're grieving and you feel betrayed.
Yeah. So before we turn this into a therapy session for me, I want to ask, are most of your sessions in person or virtually?
They're all virtual. So every one of my clients is telehealth. My supervisor had an office and we were like, half the time people want to just do it online because you can do it from the comfort of your home and they don't want to drive, or our office is really far. So we started doing all telehealth. So I see all my clients telehealth.
Okay.
Something else I wanted to say is when you were talking about how many people you've lost. One, I hear that often too. And it's devastating as a therapist because my brain goes to, I wonder what would have happened if they had met me. I wonder if they had made that decision if they didn't feel alone. Because sometimes I recognize in sessions, my clients aren't just talking about PTSD and trauma. Sometimes it's companionship. They come to sessions because they're like, oh, Beth sees me. She'll sit here and listen to me. We can talk about my day. And there's companionship and they don't feel isolated and alone. And that's usually a thing that I see is it's those people who feel isolated and alone that feel hopeless, right? That hopelessness. And then they make the decision to maybe take their life or they don't want to be here anymore. And another one that I hear often, and I like to say it, it's called passive ideation. Thoughts such as, I wish I wasn't here anymore. I wish that it would all just end. I wish it would all just stop, right? Doesn't mean you're acting on it, but that's a passive ideation is what we call it in therapy. And that's a sign of like, hey, there's something there that's deeper rooted. You probably need to talk about it. And that's how I started my TikTok was I had my client and at the end of session, I told him, hey, I am so proud of you. Like you're doing amazing. Like you're doing such a great job. Like, do you see the progress that you're made? Like, I'm so proud of you. And he got quiet and he got uncomfortable. And I immediately noticed and I was like, hey, what's going on? Talk to me about it, right? And he's like, I've never heard that, Beth. And I'm like, heard what? What are you talking about? And he was like, I've never heard somebody say that they're proud of me and they mean it. And I'm like, your mom, your ex-wife, the girls you've dated? And he was like, I've never heard it, not once. Like I couldn't even tell you if I've ever heard that. And I was shocked. And I actually remember I looked at him in session and I had tears come into my eyes. And I always tell my clients, I'm not crying out of pity. I'm crying because I'm hurting. I'm feeling empathy for you that is such a terrible thing that you've never experienced that. And it hurts me as a human being and as a therapist. So I told him, well, I'm going to make it a point to tell you every time I see you. And he was like, okay. And he got, I got to go, Beth. And he like ended the session. And then the next thing I was like, how do you feel? And he was like, it was really nice to hear it. He's like, and I could feel myself like getting like emotional at the fact that you were saying it to me. And I was like, yeah, I could see that. And so he was inspiration. And I started TikTok and I just told people, hey, I'm proud of you. And that's kind of now built up my following somehow. And I mean it. And I tell everybody, I mean it when I say it because I do. And you guys don't hear it. It's not done in the military. I don't think it's done for men probably in general. And if you come and you hear it from me, then I'm so glad to do it for you because you deserve to hear that because you're worthy of it too.
Yeah, no, I love seeing you pop up on my TikTok with hi. And then you give us an awesome positive message. So if you're not following Beth. We're going to post all her socials below in the description. But I know we're going a little bit longer than expected here, but I want to make sure I ask you one thing.
Yeah.
And I think that it will be hopefully the most value that anyone that is listening can get from this. But what would you say to a veteran who has thought about therapy, but in his mind, he would rather talk to one of his buddies or someone that understands him or someone that's, been there at the bar drinking over a drink, and that's how they cope with it? Like, what would you say is the biggest difference or the biggest reason of why you should definitely seek professional help? And just touch on that a little bit if you would, please.
Yeah. So one, I would say keep doing that because it is coping and it does help you, and that is feeling seen. And if you're worried that somebody's not going to be able to understand you, like me, right? I'm a civilian. You're going to be like, what the hell does Beth know? She's never been in the military. I would say, yeah, but I also got training on how to do this. And I start to recognize things, and your buddies aren't going to sit there and know, oh, hey, he's grieving. Oh, hey, she's grieving. Oh, hey, what you're experiencing is loss and betrayal. They're going to be able to relate to you and talk to you about like what's happening and themes. They're not going to be able to get to that secondary because they probably don't even know that they're feeling it. And instead, it's just two people talking about surface level things, and those count and they matter and they can help you cope with your day and get past things. But until you dive deeper and you process things, they're going to keep coming up as reoccurring themes in life. So that grief is going to turn to anger because you don't know it. And that anger is going to impact how you parent. It's going to impact your relationships with your partners. It's going to impact your families and your relationship with your siblings or your parents who can't understand, can't relate, right? If they weren't in the military. And then it's going to kind of bleed out into all these areas, is how I say. It's like an open wound and it's going to keep bleeding out. And yeah, sometimes you're going to put that Band-Aid on it, but guess what? It's going to need stitches. It's going to need stitches that keep it together. And those stitches, those are going to rip open sometimes. And guess what? That wound might get kind of sore. And when it's cold outside, it might kind of burn or it kind of aches, right? It's going to be lifelong. But if you learn how to stitch it and heal it a little bit, it's not going to be cured, but it's going to learn how to manage. It's not going to keep bleeding out. And something that I see, another theme is childhood really impacts you guys. Your childhood impacted the decisions that you make in the military. And then that impacts how you parent and that impacts your relationships also. And so when I see these themes, another one is how you parent is how your parents parented. And then your kids are going to parent what they see unless somebody decides to break the cycle. And if there's one thing that you guys are, it is so courageous. And I remind my clients, you have the ability to do something with this courage. You've already been courageous the entire time you were in the military. You guys already have this drive. I call my vets protectors and providers. And I'm like, are you being protective of your own legacy of your kids? If you're not dealing with the stuff that you need to, it's coming out as anger. You get home and all your kids see is dad's drinking, dad's fighting, dad is arguing, dad is sleeping all the time, dad doesn't work out, dad's just pissed off, he doesn't talk, he's not fun, right? That changes how kids view you, and then kids parent how they're parented too. And so it's a legacy. And if you want to heal that wound, if you want to be able to suture it, that's where therapy comes in. You're putting a Band-Aid on it for sure, talking to your, people that you've served with or people who can understand and relate. But they're not going to be able to recognize, hey, that's grief. Like when you were like, Beth, I never knew that was grief. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's grief. You've never heard that before, but I'm sure that you've probably talked to so many people that you've served with about things. And how often have you heard somebody in there tell you, oh, hey, Juan, you're dealing with grief right now?
Yeah, never. Yeah, you're opening up all sorts of ideas, not bad ones, right? But I think that we could talk for a long time about this, but I think I think that veterans, we get out and we feel like we have to deal with the issues that we had in the military, but I never once thought about dealing with the trauma that the childhood gave me, and there's definitely stuff there, right? But I guess we think we have to deal with the most immediate one, and we don't think about who we were and why we joined. And I've talked about this before on some of my videos, but I think that a lot of service members, they go into the service because they're looking for more than what they are. They're looking for possibly father figure mentors, to become leaders themselves. And, we get that and then we lose it. And then we don't realize that there's a reason why we were attracted to that. And like you said, it more than likely stems from our childhood. So definitely a lot of different points of views that matter here. So
Yeah.
yeah, wow. I'm
Childhood
very
is
enlightened right now.
a whole different category. That's then the other thing that I see. And I always will tell my clients I usually see two patterns to childhood and leading into how you guys join the service. And that you usually fit into those categories. Of course, there's outliers, right? And just really briefly, because I know we're over, either you had a home that was extremely authoritarian, and that is a dad that's like, do as I say right now, instantly, and you get two kids from that. You get either a kid who is very rebellious and will make really poor decisions and wants to like act out and wants to push the limits, or you get kids that are very obedient and are like, okay, I know how to follow the rules. I know what's expected out of me. And you join the military and you make a great military member. You're like, yep, I know how to follow the rules. I know what's expected of me. I know how to follow directions. And the defiant ones will make bad choices and then be like, oh, I was going down a really bad path. The military saved me. Right. And then I got like space and I got to relate to all these other guys who had childhoods like mine. Or you had a very like permissive and no boundary setting home. And for those ones, we call it almost like borderline negligence permissive. And those ones are like, oh, hey, there are no expectations. There are no rules. Maybe there's not a dad in the home. Maybe there's not anybody who's cares what you're doing if there is a dad in the home. And you go down a really rough path because you have no guidance and you don't know what that looks like. If there's not a dad, you go into the military and you're like, oh, there's routine, there's stability, there's guidance, there's father figures, there's somebody who gets me. All these other people can relate, right? And you latch on to that too. And if you didn't go down that route, I've had multiple people tell me like, oh, I was going down a really bad path. Like high school, I was going to make a really poor decision. I knew that it was going to be life-changing. I joined the military and it completely changed the trajectory of my life, right? Well, what happened in childhood? How did you get here? How do you relate to each other? And then you bond.
Ooh, that was me.
Yeah, and you bond together because now you have all these people who are like, oh, hey, I had a rough childhood too. Oh, hey, you didn't have a dad? I didn't have a dad. Oh, hey, guess what? This commanding officer really helps us. They guide us. Oh, hey, I've never had stability. My body actually operates kind of good in stability. I don't like it, but I kind of like the routine, but I don't like the routine, right? And you don't know what you're feeling. And you latch on to those things together and then you trauma bond. And you're like, oh, hey, these people get me. We all get each other. And like I said, there's the outliers where it's like, oh, I just really, like, I have a good mom and a good dad and I just wanted to serve. There are those mixed in, but for the most part, that's not what I see. You look stunned.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about all this, and honestly, this has been very informative. I'm very, very happy to have you on. Yeah, I don't know. I think that there's just so much there that we don't think about as veterans. And honestly, the reason why I started this podcast, the reason why I started making videos, the initial concept of it was to create a business for myself, right? But it's transformed, it's evolved, it's become much larger than what I thought it would be. And I love that because honestly, it's what I always wanted. It's always what I wanted to do. I just didn't realize that I'd be able to do it in this way. And since being able to, launch the podcast and I get messages from veterans all day, especially on TikTok. And the most surprising thing for me is just how many veterans are willing to speak up when they hear somebody else speak up first, when they hear somebody else say something that has been in the back of their minds. And one of the things I hear most is like, I never thought of it that way, or I've never heard someone say it out loud, or you can, put together words or videos of things that I wish I could say myself, or I don't know how to say. So I want to say thank you for being that voice for, the many therapists out there who I'm sure want to be able to help veterans. And hopefully hearing this episode is going to encourage the veterans that hear this episode or anyone that hears this episode to realize that there is so many benefits to actually doing the work. And I think a lot of what I talk about in my videos is doing the work and realizing that we can't latch on to an idea, a past that just isn't helpful anymore. And it was very, very awesome to talk to you. Honestly, I really
I
appreciate
loved
it.
being here.
Thank you. I love hearing that. So we will leave on this note. I'd like to ask you just to if there's anything else you'd like to leave us with, anything else that you'd like to share. I definitely want to have you back on the podcast for sure. But if
Yeah.
there's anything else, any sort of nuggets of advice or any tidbits of information you'd like to share with the listeners before we sign off here today.
I think I always would like to say that you're so worthy and you're seen and you're valuable. And I say it to all of my clients because I think you don't hear it. And I think that people need to hear that. I see you guys. I understand in the capacity that I can. I care. Somebody cares. It's worth it to try to recognize people do care about you. You come out of the service, and I think that there's an idea of people don't care. Maybe that's not the therapist for you, but somebody, the right one, will care, and you'll know that you're cared about. And when you have that space, you'll recognize it. And so I want you guys to know that I'm so proud, and I'm deeply honored also to be able to work with you in the first place. It has been my honor to help my clients, and I'm so proud of you.
Well, Beth, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And on that note, I just want to say that doing the work does matter and getting help does help. And speaking about these things, it gets easier with time because you realize that it's not as hard as it felt. It will be initially, absolutely. But like we talk a lot about on these podcasts, you don't have to be stuck where you're at if you really want to make a change in life. You have to lean into it. You have to be intentional. You have to truly just take that leap of faith and have a little bit of hope. Because when you start to see that it does work, you'll see that the work does work. So Beth, thank you so much for your time. We will go ahead and post all of your socials below, as well as a few useful tools that you shared with us. I'm sorry we didn't have enough time to dive into those, but I would love to have you back on so we can dive into those tools later on.
I would love
And
to.
that'll be it. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of the Vet Rise podcast. If today's episode inspired you, made you think, or simply just gave you hope, I have a small favor to ask. Share it with just one veteran or someone you think could benefit from my message. Your share could light a spark for them. You don't know who you might save. For more insights and to join this mission, follow my socials at JP the Veteran Coach and explore how we can rise together. Thank you for joining us, for being part of this journey, and for believing in the power of rising together as veterans. Until next time, keep pushing forward, keep rising, and never forget we are stronger together. My name is Juan Perez, and thank you for your time.